Hey everybody, sorry it's been a while. I could give all the excuses about being busy I want, but the reality is, it's like, it doesn't matter that I moved or that I was busy with schoolwork. I could have gotten this video done maybe 2 months ago. So, that said, better late than never, and today I'll give a rundown about how to assemble Rektify Mk.2. I'll give a description of just how everything fits together and hopefully give you a better understanding of that, what hardware is best used where, maybe what print orientations you should use for the parts, and how to fit in the wiring loom. Which, that said, I unfortunately simply cannot be bothered to record myself assembling the wiring loom, much less detail it. And so someone that struggles with that may want to reconsider taking up Rektify as a project of theirs. Assembling this blaster is somewhat unconventional and potentially painful. That said, to start with, you're going to need some M3x10 screws as the primary hardware throughout, going down to M3x8s and M3x5s for some select smaller parts, along with some M3x20 to 25 millimeters for screws for the gearbox mount, and 2 screws of varying lengths for mounting the cycle control switch or the flywheel motors. Honestly, that's a lot to take in as once, so I'll still be detailing this as we go through it. Preferably, you also want to tap out all the screw threads in the blaster with a drill. It could be 2.5 millimeters or the closest imperial equivalent being 7/64ths of a switch. That said, I'll go through this video with sections of this blaster's assembly divided into numerous sections, which I'll have on screen right now and detailed in the description. So for the first part of this video, I'll start with the grip assembly. The grip is one of the simpler parts of the blaster to assemble, so in order to assemble it, you'll first want to slide on the triggers before you do anything else. This would be because you cannot fit in the switches. You cannot fit them in once you already have the switches installed. After that, you're going to want to take your switches and bolt them down in the pattern below as demonstrated. Your rev trigger below, your firing trigger above. You may see that I've already run it through the grip panel, and that's because I already wired it up. If you wire it up as you assemble it, you may or may not have to actually do this. So I'll fast forward through the assembly of the actual hardware because it would be extremely tedious to watch. Alright, now with that done, you can test and make sure your switches function, which of course they probably should unless you cook them while soldering them up. After that, you can choose to install either on the grip side panels or the grip plate on first. I'll simply choose to do the plate because it's more convenient when I already have the wiring loom assembled, but you really could do this in either order. It doesn't actually matter. For the grip plate to mount onto the grip frame, you want some 3 M3x10 screws as well. Alright, with that done, do note that you may need to file out the sides of the grip frame and the channel that it mounts onto in order for them to actually be a clean fit together. It's not designed to have any room for tolerance. With that said, the final part of assembling the grip would be the side panels, which mount on with some M3x8 screws. M3x10 is actually just slightly too long, so that said, just make sure you aren't pinching any wires and slip the panel on over. Then you rinse and repeat for the other side. That just about concludes the entire grip assembly. Moving on from that is the next step, being the pusher group assembly. This is probably the most painful part of the blaster to get everything to fit in, and hence it is probably the most important part of this assembly guide to make. So firstly, we can put in the actual pusher mechanism itself. The gearbox used is just a TT box, and it bolts on into the bottom of the pusher group, with the motor facing forward in the blaster. So simply take it down, and something to note here is that I found it very difficult to find the right size hardware to fit in here, and here I have an M3/25 with 4 M3 washers, and it fits on. There are cutouts on the grip plate to accommodate for this, but optimally I guess I would have made a friction fit solution. The only downside of that was it would provide slightly less room for wiring, but there is room for wiring to spare in this blaster. But with that said, I'm not exactly prioritizing the creation of something like that. I'd rather develop things for Rektify, such as a half-dart Magwell. That said, it's another thing I've been procrastinating. So with that done, you bolt on the gearbox simply with screws like so. With that done, the next part of the assembly for Rektify would be taking the spinner, perhaps. It's not necessary to do at any point, except for final assembly, but the spinner and pusher fit on. The pusher is probably not going to be simply stacks on top, but you probably cannot add it on until the final assembly. So with that said, you will still have to fit all the wiring inside of the pusher group. Personally, I prefer to have the wiring for the connector for the flywheels going up to the left of the blaster, and the main power lead going through the right of the blaster. And that's simply because of the way the battery tray is arranged. The battery tray provides the power lead coming out from the right, and you could do it the other way if you really wanted. It would still work. It would just be slightly less efficient to assemble, and you would use maybe a few inches more wire for that. All that said, the first thing to do here is connect the pusher to the rest of the wiring loom. I would highly recommend doing something like this for both the pusher mechanism and the flywheel, more so the flywheels. The flywheels are basically mandatory to have a modular connector on them. It would be extremely difficult to disassemble the blaster otherwise, if not impossible. So I'll run through and speed through the assembly of this. First, you're going to want to take the cycle control switch and shove it through its respective area. It'll be mounted onto the pusher cover because the pusher mechanism is actually above, and its position needs to be like so. The rest of the wires fit in with the main power lead going off to the left from this perspective, but it's on the right on the actual blaster. So that goes like so. And the motor leads go up onto the other direction, which would be as depicted. Through here. I've actually have the pusher box in the way, so hold on, let me speed through this. That all done. Well, that said, the rest of the wiring is actually, you're just gonna have to fudge it and fit it in. I prefer to have a bit of slack as pictured here, so it's easier to disassemble the blaster, and Rektify really, if there's any benefit to having more empty space than it needs, it's that it makes this a whole lot easier. So here we go. You're going to want to bolt on the grip plate onto the pusher group with 6 M3x10 screws. Okay, so after that, you slip on the pusher cover, and actually no, you're going to want to make sure you have the cycle control switch mounted on, and right now actually I do not have the required screws for this. I only have one M2x10. You can go up to M2x12. Hold on, let me cut. So I went back and found some M3x12 screws, which are the longest screws you can use for mounting on the cycle control switch. So simply you're going to want to put it in position onto the pusher cover with the wires leading off and bolt it down. Alright, now with the switch mounted, you're gonna at this point probably want to lubricate your pusher mechanism, which is highly recommended. Maybe not mandatory to run for the short term or test, but definitely required for a reliable long-term function. So as you can see here, you can actually note how the cycle control works for Rektify. As you can see, it has a nice long braking window, so even with a lower torque pusher you can easily get off single shots. So you're going to want the pusher to be on the top and depressed down and almost all the way back before you button up the blaster. It simply makes it a lot easier that way. You're also going to want to shove the excess wire back into the pusher group before you fit it all in. There's plenty of space in there, don't worry. So you're also going to want to run the main power lead up and through the pusher cover. And you're also going to want to run the flywheel connector lead through the other side. With that all done, you can button up the pusher cover like so. It mounts onto the pusher group with 4 M3x10 screws. That's the assembly for the entire pusher group, the most challenging part of this build. After that's all done, we'll talk about getting on the battery tray. Alright, the battery tray is probably the simplest outright part of the blaster to assemble. It has a few caveats, but maybe that's it. In order to assemble the battery tray, it simply stacks on top of the pusher group. So run the wiring to the flywheels off and through the channel, and make sure that the battery leads don't get pinched and run through this channel. So it's just a matter of placing it down, making sure nothing's being pinched, getting 4 M3x10 screws on every corner and bolting it down. With that firmly mounted on, something to note is that right here there goes an M3 nut, which can be a Mk.2 nut, but I personally just used a hex nut, and it can fit in if you just place it down vertically, get a pair of pliers, and squeeze it in. Maybe get in an extra screwdriver and shove it in a little more to align it correctly, but that's about it. It should just fit in without any glue or any fuss. The battery tray door is probably something that requires filing down to fit, but with that done, it should eventually become relatively easy to put into place and is much less painful than getting the battery tray in and out on the original Rektify, and it's much roomier. So it's the simplest part of the assembly guide. With that, we move on to the Magwell. Alright, so the Magwell itself is fairly straightforward to assemble. The complicated part comes with mounting it onto the other sections of the blaster. It's kind of a crapshoot to get the threads to move into these joints, and I highly recommend using an Allen key for this reason. And even then, it can still be a pain because you can't thread it on and bolt it on particularly quickly. Well, the Magwell itself simply assembles with a one-piece mag release and an extension spring along with 2 screws to mount the pivot point and hold down the extension spring, and that's it. It's a lot like the caliber in that way. So grab an extension spring, and in order to bolt it onto the mag release itself, you'll want something small like an M3x5 screw. You only need to bolt it down far enough that the screw is not sticking out from the side profile of the mag release, but you can go farther, of course. Just not so far that the screw protrudes from the other side. With that done, it's best to first put down an M3x20 screw and use that to mount on the pivot point and the mag release extension spring hold down piece. So first, it's easier to get the hold down in place first. Once you thread it on a sufficient distance, you're going to want to take the mag release extension spring and hook it on to this screw. After that, bolt it down the rest of the way. With that mounted in place, the final part would be the pivot point. This is probably the trickiest part of assembling the Magwell in itself, apart, not including connecting it to other parts of the blaster, is getting the alignment screw to fit down into the position where it actually pivots on this mag release. So I'll fast forward through that. So as you can see in this case, I got it done fairly quickly, quicker than usual, and the mag release functions and the Magwell functions itself. As for the accessory, it would be the flared Magwell. The flared Magwell is dead simple to install. It's not quite a friction fit, but simply slide it onto place, get some M3x5 screws, up to 4, and then just bolt it down onto the side of the Magwell through these marked positions. With that done, you have a functional Magwell with the flared Magwell installed. The flared Magwell is optional. With all that said, if you don't like the way it looks or don't want one, or maybe just want your blaster to be as small as possible, you could of course just not install it. But of course I want to demonstrate it here. With that done, it can be a bit of a crapshoot to get the Magwell mounted onto the main body pusher group of the blaster. But in order to do that, you get, well, 4 M3x10 screws. And I highly recommend getting through, running a drill bit through the Magwell so that the screw can freely fit through it, so the Magwell does nothing but align the screw. This makes it a good bit easier to get the Magwell installed, partially because it reduces the resistance of threading it in place, but also because it helps you find which position which you actually can thread it in place. So I'll go ahead and fast forward through that as I do it now. Okay, so I'm sorry, I had to cut through the rest of that Magwell bolt-on section because it would have taken far too long. I had to go back, undo the battery tray, tighten up some things on the pusher cover, file down the interface between these two parts, and even then, bolting on the Magwell would have taken several minutes in real time. So, cutting off from that, the final part of the Magwell assembly is attaching the carry handle, and this is comparatively simple. You simply slide the wire run into its appropriate position and push the carry handle into its position and use 4 M3x10 screws to bolt it down at these 4 points. After bolting that on, do note that there are 2 sections here where you can attach the carry handle and bolt it onto the battery tray for maximum structural integrity. This is not entirely necessary, and if you do so, I recommend using some M3x8 screws. This is because it's not a vital structural joint, and this just makes it a good bit easier to attach. Okay, so I skipped recording that joint again because I had to go back and do some filing, drill out this hole a little, but it shouldn't be significantly more difficult than mounting the Magwell. In fact, it should be significantly easier. Again, that's an optional mount point. It's just recommended for maximum structural integrity. It's one of the things that makes this blaster a pain to assemble. Sorry. All that leaves us after now is mounting on the flywheel cage. That's in the next part. Alright, for mounting on the flywheel cage, I would recommend doing the actual cage itself first. Something to note here is Rektify's cage is not significantly different, like assembling it at least, from any other super stock flywheel cage, except the same flywheels, except for maybe Daybreak wheels now. I think they might be too large. And it wires up quite similarly. The main difference is in how it mounts onto the blaster, and that's what I'll detail here. In order to do so, you will need to line it up, but there's not quite anything to hold it in place for you beforehand, and you need some 2 M3x10 screws to mount on the flywheel cage. You can use screws that are slightly longer, but I wouldn't say 12 generally, 14 absolute max. At that point, you're threading in the screw past the point where there is anything to thread into. But I found M3x10 to be perfectly sufficient. So as you can see there, most of the tricky part is done just through that. It's in getting the screw to thread into the threads in the first place. So after that, you can get the Allen key and start torquing it down. So after you have the cage mounted and solid, you can connect it up through the wire channel. Like I said, this is essentially a required part of the blaster to include a modular motor connector. This would be because it's essentially impossible to disassemble the blaster without desoldering otherwise. This is partially a consequence of it being a non-clamshell design. So, as you can see here, it has now been attached, and the flywheel cage itself has been mounted. After that, there comes the wire cover. The wire cover simply slots over this wire run onto the carry handle, and you simply take some M3x5 screws and bolt it into place. And with that, you have your wire cover mounted. All that's left is the motor cover or the flywheel cage cover. You can do it in either order, but I'll do the flywheel cage cover first. Well, because it also requires you to bolt it onto the Magwell. For this, you could also use some M3x10 screws. It would be recommended for maximum structural integrity. As I've already demonstrated the flywheel cage mount, I'll skip through the rest of this. So after I cut through that, mounting the flywheel cover on through there, you use 2 more M3x10 screws to mount the flywheel cover onto the actual cage itself. Alright, now the final piece of the blaster is the motor cover, which simply you can place down on top, bolt on the front 2 screws onto the flywheel cage, and there are 2 rear screws that from the carry handle onto the motor cover, which I also recommend using shorter M3x8s on simply for convenience. The mount from the motor cover onto the flywheel cage can also just be M3x10. Of course, technically you could use slightly shorter screws, but there's no issue with using M3x10 and not having enough thread room. In fact, you could probably use longer screws as well. Finally, for the last 2 joints that are essential to the blaster and not related to the accessories, would be 2 M3x8s back here, as I've said. They should not be much harder than mounting the carry handle onto the battery tray. So the final part of the blaster assembly would be adding accessories. Technically, all of these are optional, although in my opinion the blaster at least needs Picatinny to look complete, which mounts on with M3x10 screws all the way through. For demonstration purposes, I will not thread on every single one of these points which I have spaced throughout the Picatinny, and only the ones necessary to demonstrate it mounting. So with the top Picatinny mounted, you next have to mount the bottom Picatinny. The only thing you need to note when mounting any of these is just to make sure you have them the right way. With that done, the next step would be the stock and sling points, which mount on the back, of course, and bolt in place with 4 M3x10 screws, of which I will only insert 2 at the moment for demonstration and brevity. And finally, out of the accessories, there's the flash hider. This is probably the most strictly optional part of the blaster as far as an addition goes, and it simply slides on, and bolts down with 2 M3x8 screws. And simply bolts on to the motor cover and the flywheel cover. And finally, with the flash hider mounted, that's about all that needs to be done to assemble Rektify.